Hi, Ben. Thanks for sending your slides through again.
Pleasure.
I'll share that on the screen, and then you can talk through what you've seen over the last month or so.
Lovely.
There we go. If we start, go to start, and I'll put that on full screen. There we go.
Lovely. So the PM Room update for May 2024 is all about sheep. There are cattle, obviously, but we're talking about sheep today. There are three main things. Pasteurellosis has started to happen. Now it's probably just as common to get nematodirus as coccidiosis, or more common, and some worm resistance is emerging, I'd say, and want to make plans to not miss it in the coming grazing season. So to start with, pasteurellosis, starting to see lambs that are somewhere like 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks old presenting with pneumonia. So that's cranioventral consolidation, like the picture on the right here, or septic pleurisy, like the picture on the left. And the problem is that the immunity gap between losing maternal immunity to pasteurella, probably from vaccine or from natural immunity, that drops off by 3 to 4 weeks, and lamb's own immunity doesn't kick in until probably 7 or 8 weeks if you vaccinate them, and probably if you don't vaccinate them later. So as this next graph shows, you have a gap here where I've got a red arrow there. The red declining arrow is this is time going past, is declining maternal antibodies there. They're all gone by about 3 or 4 weeks. Then if you give them a vaccine, first vaccine of their 3-week birthday, then a month later at 7 weeks, you have wave after wave after wave of protective antibodies. Conversely, which means that the immunity gap, which is in the next slide, my little circle here between 3 weeks and 7 weeks, that's the gap where there is no vaccinal immunity. That's as small as you're ever going to get it. If you leave the first dose, as in this next slide, until 8, 9, 10 weeks later on, you can see how much bigger that immunity gap is there. That great big donut-shaped purple circle there is the immunity gap, where the lambs don't have any immunity. So I'm not saying whether you vaccinate your lambs with Ovivac, Heptovac, something with a pasteurella in it or not, but what I do think is a good idea, if you do it early, because you get the earlier you do them, the more bang for your buck you get, and the more days cover for the same cost of vaccine. So if you are going to do them early. Obviously use clean needles, all that stuff, but do them early if you're going to do them, would be my suggestion, to minimize the size of that immunity gap, if that makes sense. That's pasteurellosis starting to emerge now, well worth diagnosing and easy to see grossly. The next one is before last month, we were mainly dealing with coccidiosis in little lambs. Now, because we've the end of May now, we're just as likely, if not more likely, to have nematodirus. And here, just to remind everybody, here are some pictures of nematodirus. You probably are starting to see some nematodirus eggs now, although obviously the disease can happen before the eggs emerge, and you just see the worms like in this picture, and this picture in the filter, and the next picture, just the worms teeming in the small intestine like that. And then the next picture is of the same thing, just the millions and millions of nematodirus worms emerging at the same time to kill the lambs very quickly. So what we've been seeing, as the next slide shows, is that some people have been doing a worm egg count, and you see nematodirus eggs as well as other trichostrongal eggs, and you think, well, you know that the white drench is the recommendation for nematodirus, but you have in the back of your mind, well, there is most resistance to white drenches among the trichostrongal worms, probably Telodorsagia circumcincta this time of year, and so is that the best treatment for it? It'll take out the nematodirus, but you've got that doubt, will it take out the trichostrongal worms as well? So here is a message for now and for the rest of the grazing season to figure out, are these wormers working as effectively as they should be? As in, test the efficacy of your wormers by monitoring. And there are two ways of doing this, a drench test or a fecal egg count reduction test. And either is true. But if you're treating with a white drench at this moment, and you've got trichostrongal eggs as well as nematodirus eggs, then it's worth taking a fecal sample if it's a clear drench, sorry, if it's a white drench, I should say, benzimidazole 14 days later. And I'll tell you the intervals now, so we remember them. 14 days for a white drench, 7 days for levamisole, and 14 days for a clear drench. And then, well, the purpose of the rest is to try to explain why the intervals post-drenching are as they are for the white drench and for the clear drench. And the interval post-drenching is very important so that we don't confuse reinfection with resistance. That's the big issue here. So,
very good.
This is what happens when you treat. The first thing to say is that when you've got eggs is a proxy for adult worms. Not all the worms in a sheep will be adult, but if there are eggs, that's the proxy for the adult worms, because obviously only adult worms lay eggs. So you're using the eggs as a because you can't kill every lamb and count the number of worms in it. You have to. The easiest thing is to use the eggs as a proxy for the number of adult worms. Now, only the adult worms are laying eggs. That's the first thing to say. So this is what happens. You kill the worms, right? Let's say you use an effective wormer. Let's say you're the luckiest farmer in the world and you've got a Telodorsagia circumcincta that is susceptible to a white drench. So you use your white drench, you kill the adult worms on day 1. Then what happens? So you're looking at two things on this diagram. You're looking at the big red circle with the eggs in it, and you're looking at what's going on in the sheep. So two things happen on days 4 to 5 after the sheep has been wormed. You will still have eggs because those eggs won't have all been passed yet. They won't have all been pooed out because it takes a while. Obviously, they're still there. The worms are dead, but the eggs are still there. So it takes 4 to 5 days for all those worms to be passed, if that makes sense, even though the worms are dead. If I take a sample at day 5, I will find eggs, but they will belong to the worms that are now dead. So I will think that the wormer hasn't worked when really it has, because the worms are dead even though the eggs are still there, if that makes sense. But also on this picture, you can see that there are some little immature worms that have started to reinfect the sheep, but they haven't started to lay any eggs yet. That's the picture there. You can see those little worms starting to get into the sheep. Those eggs there don't belong to those little worms. They belong to the adult worms that have already been killed. Okay, what happens next? Day 2 to day 21, these little worms that have been, as I said, these little worms that are coming in, they're developing in. But from day 5, there are no eggs. Because it takes 16 to 21 days for those little worms to grow up big enough to start laying eggs themselves. So there is a spell where there are no eggs if the wormer has been effective. Right, what happens next? Those worms aren't laying any eggs yet because they're still growing. They aren't old enough to lay any eggs. Right, next one. So when you get to day 16 post-drenching, those new worms that have just been infected the minute after you kill the other ones, and the next worms that have been ingested, 16 to 21 days after they've been injected, they start laying eggs, right? So if I take a worm egg count at day 16 to 21, I will not be measuring the worms that came from I will not be measuring the eggs from the worms that were present at the time it was treated. I'll be measuring the newly infected worms, and they've never been exposed to the wormer, so they will not be resistant. That's reinfection, not resistance. So if I measure those eggs, I will think that the wormer hasn't worked when it really has. All the worms that were in the sheep at the time it was wormed have been killed, but these are the new worms that have come through and reinfected the sheep that may or may not be resistant to the wormer that you used. Are you with me? So if we just go back a minute, what happens if the worms don't die? Just to recap, there is a moment between the worms dying and the new worms coming in where there are no eggs if the wormer has been effective, right? What happens if the worms don't die? Let's have an experiment to see what happens if the worms don't die. So here's day 1. I treat them with a wormer, but they don't die. Do they keep laying eggs or not? Let's find out. Sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. So sometimes these worms will never stop laying eggs. They're resistant. You treated them with a white drench or a clear drench, and it's done absolutely nothing to them at all. It hasn't bothered them. They carry on laying eggs. They never stop. But sometimes they do stop, especially if you've underdosed them. Sometimes they might be slightly annoyed by the drench, but not killed. And they pack in laying eggs, but they don't die. Okay. Now, if I treat them in this interval, as you can see from the circles here, if the worms are still there, they've just stopped laying eggs for a while because the wormer has annoyed them. So if I treat them there, if I take another sample during that period, I might think the wormer has worked when it really hasn't, right? So I might be wrong the other way round. So that happens between day 5, when the residual eggs from the previous worming have been spat out, and day 14. If they've been annoyed but not killed, they will resume laying eggs by day 14. So that's the window. Are you with me so far?
Yep. So far, so good.
Good. So then what happens after day 14? So they'll resume laying eggs in 12 days or so. So by day 14, they will have resumed laying eggs if they haven't been killed. So as the next slide shows, I think for a white drench or for a clear drench, day 14 is a day. So we'll go over it again. Here's a wormer.
Sorry.
Kill the worm. Here's a wormer. Sorry, here's the worms. Treat the worms. Day 5. There are still eggs, and the worms may or may not have been killed, right? If I sample then, I'll think I've killed them, which I have. And if I sample then, I'll think they're still there, but they're not. And then there is a spell where there are no eggs. And there may be no eggs because the worms have been killed, or there may be no eggs because the worms have been annoyed and they've stopped laying eggs temporarily, right? But they will resume laying eggs by day 14, which is in the next slide. So day 14 is a critical day for a white drench or a clear drench, because by day 14, they've either haven't been killed and they're laying eggs again, or they have been killed and they stopped laying eggs temporarily and they've resumed laying eggs, or they've been killed and there are no more eggs. Does that make sense? So on day 14, if I have eggs, I've got resistance. If I don't have eggs, I haven't got resistance. And then moving on to the next day, which I think
I'll just come in there quickly, Ben. Sometimes you get eggs because you've underdosed and you haven't got resistance. Mm-hmm. So it's a good point to say that if you get eggs on day 14, go back and check that you've given the animals the correct dose for their weight, because that's always a possibility that something has slipped through and you've maybe given the wrong dose. So that's always the first check. But if they've had the right dose, it is suggestive that you've got a problem. Anyway, moving on, next slide.
After day 14, if I sample on day 16 to 21, I'm not sampling the eggs from the worms that were killed. I'm sampling the eggs from the newly acquired worms that were ingested the day after the sheep was treated, because we're only talking here about non-persistent wormers that kill the worms that are in the sheep but don't have any residual action. So after the wormers have been used, the worms, if they are ingested, don't continue to get killed. So the day after they're treated, I can pick up new infections, and those new infections will take 16 to 21 days to grow up to be old enough to be laying eggs again. And I do not want to measure those eggs, find them and say that I've got resistance, because that is just reinfection, not resistance. Those worms may or may not be resistant, but you can't say on that evidence that they are, because they've never been exposed to the wormer and had a chance to be killed by it, if that makes sense. So that's why the 14-day is critical for a clear drench and a white drench. And you just have to remember that levamisole is a bit different 7 days, as we'll come to in a minute. But that's why you've got to wait for the previous eggs to be got rid of. You have to wait to see if they're going to stop laying eggs and then resume. And then you have to do it soon enough before they're reinfected by new worms laying new eggs. And as you rightly say, it can look like you've got resistance if you underdose. And I'm assuming that, you know, it's probably not right to assume that nobody underdoses, because lots of people do underdose, but underdosing can change everything. if you think
Absolutely.
you haven't.
It's still an issue where people don't always weigh the sheep and then make an educated guess as to what they think they might weigh. And even more common is people not calibrating the dosing equipment regularly, so they inadvertently give an underdose even if they've weighed them properly.
And what's your experience, Matt? Do people normally underestimate the dose of a sheep or overestimate it?
Underestimate
usually. I would say underestimate too.
Yeah. I was at a farmer meeting last night, and a lady there said she'll now get the old weigh crate out with a spring balance on and check the biggest ones in the group, because she was surprised when she had a ewe that weighed over 100 kilos. And I think that's not uncommon. You know, big fit mule will be close to 100 kilos. So
I think they often weigh heavier than they look. Yeah.
So weighing is really important. Calibrating your kit is really important, because if you're going to the time and trouble of dosing the animals, you want to make sure that you've got the best chance of it being effective.
Absolutely.
Next slide.
Next slide is just a nod to the fact that a fecal egg count reduction test, where you take a sample on the day of dosing and then you take another sample 7 or 14 days later, that is probably the gold standard. And the really gold standard is to, when you do it within the same individual sheep, you take a sample on the day you collect it, you do a worm egg count, and then the same individual sheep, you take a sample at after 7 days for a levamisole and 14 days for a white or clear in the same individual sheep, and do that 15 times with individual sheep. It all becomes rather expensive if you're paying for worm egg counts. So that's the fecal egg count reduction test method. But what do you think, Matt?
Well, again, this is the gold standard. Individual samples, same animals, pre and post treatment. But as you said, it does get a bit expensive. So the other option is you can do what's called a drench check, where you do a mob sample, a pooled sample before treatment. So you know how many eggs are likely to be the average for the group. So you take 15 samples, pool it, mix it up, do one test on that. And then ideally, if you can get the same 15 and pool them again after treatment, you're getting an indication of how effective the treatment has been for the cost of 2 samples instead of 30. So much more cost effective, not as accurate, but it gives you a good indication of how effective your treatment's been. And if you can do that every time you use the wormer, then you get a much broader picture across the whole season for a reasonable cost, rather than spending lots of money every time.
Yes, still, yeah. And I think that's the point, isn't it? Because different species of worms will be active at different times, and it's probably more important, if you have the choice, to do several different drench tests than just one individual fecal egg count reduction test, if you've only a certain amount of money to spend, if you aren't doing them themselves. Obviously, so it's a trade-off.
Yeah, trade-off between expense and accuracy. And I think if you're, when you're paying for somebody else to do the worm egg counts for you, you're much better to do lots of checks through the season to get an idea of which drenches are working at which time of year. And certainly, if you then find out if one hasn't been fully effective, you can go back and retreat quickly. But it gives you an idea of what's happening over the season for a reasonable amount of money, rather than spending all your money on one test at one time on one wormer.
Yes.
And I think that gives you a broader information and something to work on. If you find one that doesn't stack up terribly well, then you can always investigate that more thoroughly.
Yes. And if you forget to take a sample on drenching day, then all is not lost, because you can still take a sample 7 or 14 days later, and that sample is still worth something. If there aren't any eggs in it, it probably isn't worth as much, because there may not have been any eggs when you did it on the first day. But if there are still eggs present at 7 days after the levamisole or 14 days after a clear or a white, then that does mean something. And assuming you haven't underdosed and all that stuff, then that is suggestive of resistance and worthy of further investigation, probably.
Absolutely. Again, you don't know how many eggs were there to start with, so we're looking for an 80 or 90% reduction in worm egg count on the mob samples, whereas we're looking for 95% on the individuals. But if there are eggs there post-treatment, you might get an egg count of 100 or 150, and you've still had a 90% reduction if it was very high beforehand. So again, it's a heads up that we need to look at again. It doesn't tell you you've definitely got a problem.
It's a good screen.
Good screen. And that's what we want. We want to be screening all the time to work out if there's something we need to investigate more closely.
And there is, I believe, still some funding for it on the Animal Health and Welfare Pathway, and which you need to get in touch with your vets about. There
is in England and in Scotland, the what they call it, preparing for sustainable farming. There's money available for doing drench checks and worm egg counts in Scotland as well. Again, speak to your vets, and they can guide you through what to do there. And I'm not sure what's available in Wales. There was a bit of a chat on the Sheep Vet Society conference online yesterday, but unfortunately I missed that, so I'll have to go and check it again later.
Yes, but so I think the only thing you have to remember is a white drench is 14 days, a yellow drench is different. You just have to remember that it's different 7 days, and a clear drench is 14 days, because there's that interval between the previous eggs being got rid of and the newly acquired eggs being larvae starting to lay eggs again. That's your window to check that the wormer hasn't been fully effective.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Ben. I'll stop sharing that now.
Thank you.
Yeah. Great reminder. Thank you for that, and something that we should be thinking about for the whole of the worm season, which is not just the summer. I think we tend to fall into the trap of thinking worms in the summer, something else in the winter.
Definitely.
But the worm season goes on till November.
Some years it never stops.
Some years it never stops. Yep. Excellent. All right. Thank you very much for that, Ben. Look forward to seeing what you find this coming month.
Very good. We'll see you in June.
Thank you, Ben.